Something every pilot needs to do proficiently is fly a circuit. On return from almost every sortie, the normal return is by a circuit, and you must be able to fly it well. Firstly, in this session we will describe the normal circuit and talk about how to fly it, and then to finish up, we'll fly a circuit in real time. Now, what numbers are we trying to achieve in a normal circuit? The circuit is a racetrack shape, with both a crosswind and base turn flown at constant but different angles of bank. This is different to a civilian circuit, which is more of a rectangular pattern. The takeoff is standard, with the important point being to fly the extended center line after takeoff. When safely airborne, complete the after takeoff checks, and at 130 knots, anticipate the left rudder and set 40 psi. Accelerate to the climb speed of 140 knots. At 500 feet, and when clear of any downwind traffic, start the crosswind turn. In nil wind, the required angle of bank is 40 degrees. The maximum angle is 60 degrees. And the aim is to vary the bank angle, depending on wind, to roll out the correct downwind spacing. Level out at 1,000 feet above ground and adjust power to maintain 140 knots. This will require about 18 to 20 psi. The minimum speed on downwind is 120 knots. The correct nil-wind downwind spacing is with the center of the roundel on the wing tracking along the center of the runway. Do the pre-landing checks before the aircraft is halfway down the runway and plan to arrive at the base turn point between 120 and 135 knots. 120 is ideal. The base turning point changes with wind. The aim here is to roll out on finals on glide slope at between 400 and 600 feet. In winds of up to 10 knots, turn at 2 chords, up to 20 knots at 1.5, and for more than 20 knots, turn at 1 chord. At the base turn point, roll to 30 degrees angle of bank. In nil wind, set about 10 psi. Select takeoff flap, make the radio call, and of course, trim. 2 things to watch here. Firstly, maintain the 120 knot attitude until 110 knots, and then set the 110 knot attitude. Secondly, 10 psi is a tricky power to set. You are better off being a little on the high side than the low side, because accurate power settings are difficult in the low range. The base turn is then flown at 110 knots, and the aim is to maintain a constant angle of bank to roll out on the extended center line between 400 and 600 feet. Once established on finals, select the landing flap and fly at 95 knots. The threshold speed is 85 knots, and you should achieve this just prior to crossing the threshold. The aiming point is the runway numbers, and the aircraft must touch down by the 1,500 feet markers. After landing, smoothly lower the nose wheel onto the runway and pull the stick right back to get the weight onto the main wheels. Do not commence braking until all the weight is on the wheels and you are below the aquaplaning speed of 67 knots. Turn off the center line when the speed is below 60 knots. For a touch and go landing, after the nose wheel is on the runway, set 3 seconds of right rudder trim, then smoothly up to MCP, accelerate and rotate at 80 knots. So that's what we are trying to achieve in a circuit. Now, how do we do it? Firstly, be aware of the speed of this aircraft. The entire circuit is over in only 4 minutes, so you must be well prepared before you even arrive at the aircraft. Thinking ahead is mandatory if you are to fly a successful circuit. For example, as you line up for takeoff, you should already be thinking of how much bank is required on crosswind, and so on. Secondly, look out and listen out are most important in the circuit area, because this is one of the most congested areas where you will fly. It is your responsibility to ensure that you keep clear of other aircraft and that you do not cut anyone off. We'll be talking more about lookout throughout the session. So, we start with takeoff. As you are clear to line up, always check finals for aircraft and the windsock for the actual wind and commence a line-up checklist. Include a faster line of the AHRS in the line-up checks. Also, mentally refresh yourself on the emergency briefing, especially if there are built-up areas near the runway. Bring the aircraft to a stop on the center line. Make sure the nose wheel is centered and that the aircraft is accurately lined up. To do this, cross-check the aircraft heading with a runway heading. Set the heading bug with the runway heading, and this will assist upwind tracking.
11303, line up and hold. 11303, line up.
Do the line-up checks as soon as possible after being cleared to line up, because apart from anything else, it makes a lot of sense to have the strobes going whenever you're on the runway. Now is the time to think about the crosswind turn. Any traffic on downwind, the wind, or what angle of bank you will aim for. Be warned, 1,000 feet happens very quickly, so you must keep ahead of the aircraft. Now you're ready. After your takeoff clearance, set 30 psi, release the brakes, and smoothly set takeoff power. As always, when setting full power, check the torque and the ITT are within limits. Max power is used for the first takeoff, and max continuous, or MCP, is used for subsequent takeoffs. The main point to be aware of during the takeoff is the amount of right rudder required to keep the aircraft on the center line. Keep the wings level with aileron. With crosswind, you will need some aileron into the wind and a little opposite rudder. Then just use whatever is required to keep it straight. At 80 knots, rotate until the instrument combing meets the horizon. When safely clear of the ground, brakes on off and complete the after takeoff checks. This is where your pre-planning will pay off because the aircraft accelerates so rapidly. At 130 knots, set 40 psi, back about 3 to 4 centimeters on the PCL. Anticipate the left rudder required, and then select the attitude to maintain 140 knots in the climb. It's the same as the 180 knot climb attitude. Now trim. You will need at least 3 seconds of left rudder. Approaching 500 feet, have a good look out for aircraft on downwind and ahead on upwind. You should know what other aircraft are doing from their radio calls. So if the aircraft in front of you is doing the same circuit as you, commence to turn when you are abeam. This is definitely the time to sort out spacing with other aircraft. So, to recap the upwind leg, firstly, make sure you think ahead. And secondly, plan to track the extended center line. And thirdly, anticipate the rudder and large power change at 130 knots. And finally, be aware of other traffic and have a good look out before you turn crosswind. The crosswind turn is one of the biggest problem areas with circuits because of the angle of bank you need, 40 degrees in nil wind.
It will feel strange at first, but you must sweat in that bank angle if you want to roll out correctly on downwind. The maximum angle of bank is 60 degrees, and don't forget, rudder into the turn. Be aware that you will have to lower the nose slightly to maintain 140 knots.
Then the turn work cycle of lookout, attitude, performance. If you are at the pre-solo stage and climbing to 1,000 feet before commencing the turn, you will need a little extra power in the turn to maintain speed. As you are a little over halfway through the turn, look over your shoulder and check runway position. You may need to adjust the bank slightly to achieve the proper spacing. The trap here is to watch the runway too much and end up way off altitude and speed. Your priority is to fly accurately and then use a quick glance to assess the turn. Once you have done that, get straight back into the work cycle. Any further corrections can be done on downwind. A couple more things happen during crosswind. Firstly, the level off. Anticipate by 10% of the rate of climb, usually about 100 feet. Simultaneously set 18 to 20 psi, left rudder with the power reduction, and the level flight attitude. If you're at the correct speed, this is with the horizon about 2 centimetres above the AOA indicator. The last part of the crosswind turn is, of course, the rollout. You should have a planned rollout heading which you set up on the heading bug before you start the turn. Roll out on this heading. Don't forget rudder and maintain it. Then all that is left to do is trim, trim, trim. That's crosswind. It's one of the busiest times in the circuit, but if you fly it properly, it will make the rest of your job that much easier. Now we're on downwind. Remember, the minimum speed is 120 knots, and we aim to fly at the correct spacing until base. When you roll out, the first thing to do is check your spacing. With no drift laid off, the center of the roundel should track down the runway center line. Whenever you do this, make sure that you have the wings level.
Check your visual attitude. A quick way to confirm is to glance at the sky pointer.
If the spacing is incorrect, make an appropriate heading correction and maintain that correction. While the correction is taking effect, get the pre-landing checks out of the way. Then recheck the spacing and adjust the heading and heading bug as required. A good work cycle for downwind is height, heading, spacing, speed. Keep doing this as you track downwind, and don't forget to listen out for any other traffic both ahead and behind. You are aiming to arrive at the base turning point at 120 knots. Remember that as the airspeed decreases, you will need to raise the nose and trim nose up. Don't descend on downwind. If you are regularly flying at a particular airfield, take note of any ground features. Railway lines, large trees or chicken sheds are ideal, and use these with your flying. It's not cheating. It just makes good sense to use everything that's available to you. When you pass a beam that touches down into the runway, concentrate on accurate flying. This is an area where all the good work on downwind can be undone very quickly, because some people feel compelled to keep looking over their shoulder at the runway. Don't worry about it. It won't move. The base turn point depends on wind, and the aim is to roll out on finals on glide path between 400 and 600 feet. Because it always takes the same time to turn through 180 degrees and a strong wind moves us downwind, we turn base earlier with wind to achieve the desired finals position. No wind is considered as 10 knots or less. Turn base at 2 chords. For 11 to 20 knots at 1.5. And for more than 20 knots, turn at 1 chord. You should only need to look at the runway once or maybe twice after you pass the threshold to assess your spacing. So once again, the points to watch on downwind. Have your heading bug set up and roll out on that heading. Trim accurately for the level off. Use the work cycle of height, heading, spacing, and speed. Use any ground features available to you and concentrate on accurate flying, particularly after you pass a beam the runway. Now for the base turn. This is another area where you have a number of things to do and you must be prepared. Firstly, have a thorough look out. You don't want to be yet another base turn statistic. Think of all the paperwork you could create for someone. But seriously, lookout is very important here because you could have glide circuit traffic from above, or more commonly, instrument traffic on long finals. Never turn until you are sure that the area is clear. All clear. Now simultaneously roll to 30 degrees. Don't forget rudder. Reduce power to approximately 10 psi. Back about ½ centimetre. Select takeoff flap. And select an attitude which will commence a descent and allow the airspeed to reduce during the turn to 110 knots. Left rudder, trim, check the power, and make the base radio call.
11303, base 3 greens, touch and go. 11303, clear touch and go, check wheels. 11303.
Beware of the small PCL movement required to set 10 psi. Remember that the base turn point is where the turn starts, so make sure that your lookout is complete before you reach the point. It is a very common mistake for people to turn a late base, so think ahead and don't get caught. You must be looking out the front to fly this maneuver properly. Don't look anywhere else until the aircraft is stable and trimmed. Now fly accurately and don't look at the runway. It's still there. Headwind and crosswind will affect your bank angle and the power you set. As a guide, with 10 knots of headwind, add 2 psi and increase bank angle by 5 degrees. Vice versa for any tailwind. Remember that the winds at circuit altitude may be quite different to those on the ground. How do we assess how the base turn is going? Firstly, to make any assessment valid, you must fly accurately. Ideally, you should be at about 800 feet halfway around the turn. If you're 100 feet high, decrease the power by 2 psi. The reason that you should be 800 feet and not 750 feet halfway around the turn is that you don't start descending at the beginning of the turn. Remember that around base, rate of descent is controlled by power and attitude controls speed. Look for a point on the extended center line and fly towards that point. Don't look at the threshold. If your altitude and speed are wrong, fix up the speed and then the altitude, but only one at a time. The idea is to eliminate as many variables as possible so that it's easier to fly. So, that's the base turn. Remember to have a good look out before you turn. Run through the actions and keep looking out the front until the aircraft is stabilized. The aim of the base turn is to position on finals so that a safe approach can be made. At the correct distance out, you should be at about 500 feet plus or minus 100 feet. Some people call this being in the slot. If you are outside these limits, you must overshoot and try it again. Never persist with a poor approach. Now that you are on finals, the flying technique changes. Because the aircraft is being flown towards a fixed landing point, attitude now controls the aiming point, and PCL controls speed. In Phase 3, you will select land flap as you roll out on finals, then fly 95 knots down finals. For later phases, you will select land flap on short finals and slow to threshold speed. Remember that it's always better to select flap early and increase power to maintain speed than select it late and be too fast. Now the work cycle on finals is easy, but it must be used continually. IAS, aim point, far end of runway. Speed is simple enough and is the only item which requires you to look inside. Remember that with finals technique, power controls speed. You will only need small changes of less than 2 psi to correct speed by 5 knots. And don't forget to keep aircraft balance every time you change power. Ideally, you should have about 10 psi set and not have to change it down finals. Eliminate the variables the same as before. Now for aim point. The aiming point is the runway numbers and they should remain fixed in the screen if you are actually flying towards them. If you are on speed and glide slope, the aim point should be about 3 centimeters above the AOA indicator. That picture will not apply if you aren't on glide slope or speed because your attitude will change. The important thing to look for here is your aiming point along the runway. That's why the scan is so important. The only way you can properly assess any rate of change is by scanning at a constant rate. If the aiming point is moving up or down the screen, you have a performance problem, i.e. speed, power, or configuration are wrong. If the aiming point is moving along the runway, you have a flying problem. So put the aiming point where you want it, then continue with the scan. This needs explaining. In this diagram, the aircraft is on finals and the aiming point is the runway numbers. Notice where the aiming point appears in the windscreen. As the aircraft flies down finals, anything above the aiming point appears to move upwards, like this cloud, and anything below the aiming point appears to move downwards, like the tree on finals here. Importantly, the only point not to move in the screen is the aiming point. So that is what you are trying to assess as you fly down finals, the point which is not moving along the runway. Also, if you are flying, say, too fast, the attitude will be different. In this case, the attitude will be lower, and so the aiming point will appear higher up the windscreen. Notice that the aiming point has not moved along the runway, only in the windscreen. Now, far end of runway. This one is important because it allows you to assess the aspect of your approach or how you are placed on glide path and center line. Look to the far end of the runway and run your eyes back towards where you are. This conscious effort allows you to look further away. and gives you much greater depth perception and stops the common problem of aiming point fixation. You should aim to speed the work cycle up so that any changes are only small ones. The faster the scan becomes, the more accurate you're flying. So that's the work cycle. Aim point, speed, far end of runway. As far as speed on finals goes, you are aiming to cross the threshold at threshold speed, 85 knots. A power reduction of 2 to 3 psi is all that is required to slow from 95, and you will do this on late finals at about 100 feet. If you are below the threshold speed, then you must overshoot and have another go. As you approach the flare, change your primary focus from the aiming point to something at the far end of the runway. Pick a tree or a house or anything, but change your focus to the far end. In other words, the final scan changes to simply far end of runway. This gives you the best perspective for judging the flare. The last look at airspeed is done immediately prior to commencing the flare. Once you begin the flare, smoothly select the landing attitude. When the rate of descent has been arrested, retard PCL to idle and maintain the landing attitude with a little back pressure because the nose will want to drop. It is important not to set idle before the descent is stopped, because otherwise a large airspeed loss will occur, resulting in a heavy landing. If you flare a little early, do not change attitude. Allow the aircraft to settle by itself. However, if you've still not touched down by the 1,500-foot markers, a go-around is mandatory. After touchdown, lower the nose onto the runway at 60 knots. Smoothly pull the stick right back to unload the wings and have the weight on the wheels. Do not commence braking until the aircraft is slowed down and the weight is on the wheels. This avoids the possibility of locked wheels and burnt-out tires. The maximum speed for braking is 67 knots, which is the aquaplaning speed. If you're doing a touch and go, after the nose wheel is on the runway, set MCP and check torque, ITT and speed. Don't take too long about this. Your priority is to look outside. Be ready for the nose swing to the left as the power comes on, and at 80 knots, rotate as normal takeoff. So, that's it for the circuit. As you can see, there is a lot involved in such a short maneuver. As I said earlier, you must be thoroughly prepared before you even walk out to the aircraft. Before you begin flying circuits, you must be able to fly an overshoot. We mentioned a number of occasions when it's mandatory to overshoot. There are 9 of them. 1. When a traffic confliction exists. 2. If your approach path is either too steep or too shallow. 3. If an S-turn is needed to line up on finals, remember the maximum angle of bank on base is 40 degrees. 4. If the aircraft is not lined up on finals by 400 feet AGL. 5. If air traffic control or the duty instructor directs you to go around. 6. If you are not happy with the approach. 7. Whenever you cannot identify preceding traffic. 8. If you reach a threshold speed prior to the threshold. And finally, 9, if you are solo and you don't have a landing clearance by 200 feet. You must know these situations, and you will be asked them during your flying. Airmanship plays an important part in deciding when to overshoot. If you can see that a confliction will occur, then overshoot from downwind if necessary. Don't create the conflict. So that's when to fly the overshoot. Now, for how to fly the overshoot. Simultaneously, apply max cruise power. Remember that this may take up to 7 seconds. Level the wings and select the climb attitude. Be prepared for the large amount of right rudder to keep balance. An elevator trim. Check for positive rate of climb and do the after takeoff checks. Brakes on off, landing gear up, flaps up, air brake in, and check landing gear lights out. Flap indicating up and air brake indicating in by 150 knots. There are 2 points to be aware of with an overshoot. Firstly, be aware of the time required for the engine to develop max cruise power. 7 seconds is a long time, and you need to anticipate by making your decision early. Secondly, the aircraft accelerates quickly in an overshoot, so keep a close eye on the airspeed until you are fully cleaned up. Now to consider tracking during an overshoot. If you overshoot from downwind or base, track for the dead side and keep a good lookout for traffic running in from initial. Aim to track 500 feet from the runway on the dead side. This should give ample separation from the initial traffic. If you overshoot from finals, initially fly straight ahead until you are sure the dead side is clear. Then proceed to the dead side. We've now discussed what to look for in the circuit, how to fly the circuit, and when and how to fly an overshoot. Now it's time to put it all together and fly a normal circuit in real time. Remember, it only takes about 4 minutes.
Just lining up on the runway. Stopping, holding on the brakes, advancing the PCL. Releasing the brakes, keeping it straight with right rudder. Now applying max power, checking torque and ITT. Holding it down and looking to rotate at 80 knots, raising the nose to the climb attitude, balancing with rudder. Safely clear off the ground, brakes on off. Landing gear up, flap up, air brakes in by 150 knots. 130 knots, reducing power. Above 500 feet, clear left, ahead, above and right, turning right. Leveling at 1,000 feet, 40 to 45 degrees of bank in the crosswind turn. Good lookout in the turn. Leveling off and reducing power to 18 psi. Look for a ground feature and adjust the angle of bank. Stabilize now on 1,000 and rolling out on downwind. Now we're on downwind, checking height, heading, spacing, speed. That looks reasonable. Now the downwind checks. Speed below 150 knots. Air brakes in. Landing gear down. Now set 20 psi. Checking 3 greens. Threshold speed 85 knots. Checking the spacing now. Abeam the threshold. 2 chords today. Start the lookout. Now the base turn, rolling, 30 degrees angle of bank, power back to 10 psi, takeoff flap, halfway around the base turn, checking height. That looks good. When you select full flap, be ready for the tendency for the nose to drop. Maintain the aiming point and trim nose up. Now rolling out on the center line, 500 feet. Now final scan, airspeed good, aiming point good, far end of runway. Good. Set land flap, reducing speed 285 knots by the threshold. Threshold speed good, looking to the far end of the runway, flaring, PCL to idle, and another smooth touchdown. Stick back, speed less than 67 knots, speed less than 60 knots, braking smoothly. That's a normal circuit in real time.